June 1944. Normandy, France, the hedgerows were still wet from the night's rain. American artillery echoed in the distance. Machine gun fire rolled across the countryside in short, violent bursts. The invasion was less than 2 weeks old, and every field seemed to hide another German position. General Dwight D. Eisenhower was visiting forward areas that morning. His staff hated it when he did that. The supreme commander of the Allied Expeditionary Force had no business being this close to the fighting. There were headquarters for a reason, maps for a reason, reports for a reason. But Eisenhower believed something simple. You could learn more from 10 minutes with soldiers than 10 hours with paperwork. So he went. The convoy moved slowly along a narrow farm road lined with thick hedges. Then it stopped. A military policeman stepped into the road and signaled for everyone to wait. Ahead, engineers were clearing a damaged bridge. The delay would take at least 20 minutes. Eisenhower climbed out of his vehicle. His aides followed. The general adjusted his jacket and looked across a nearby field. That was when he saw him, an American soldier. Alone, asleep, the soldier sat against a hedgerow only a few hundred yards from the front. His rifle rested beside him. His helmet had slipped low over his eyes. He hadn't moved. One aide immediately frowned. "Sir." Eisenhower looked at him. "That man is sleeping on duty." Another officer nodded. "Should be arrested." The general said nothing. He simply began walking toward the soldier. This is the story of what Eisenhower did when he found a soldier asleep near the front lines, and what he discovered before making a decision. Before we continue, make sure you subscribe. New stories every day. To understand why this mattered, you need to understand what June 1944 looked like in Normandy. The headlines talked about victory. The reality was exhaustion. The land beyond the beaches was a maze of hedgerows, sunken roads, and hidden German positions. American units fought for every field, every crossroads, every farmhouse. Men slept whenever they could, sometimes 10 minutes, sometimes 20, sometimes not at all. Many infantry companies had been fighting almost continuously since landing. Officers worried about ammunition, commanders worried about fuel. The soldiers worried about staying awake, because fatigue could kill just as surely as a bullet. The sleeping soldier's name was Thomas Miller, 21 years old, from Kansas. Before the war, he worked at a grain elevator outside Wichita. He had never been farther from home than Oklahoma. Now he was in France. His company had landed 6 days earlier. Since then, they had advanced through hedgerows under constant German fire. During those 6 days, Miller had slept less than 12 hours total. Nobody at headquarters knew that. Nobody had written it in a report. It didn't appear on a map. But his platoon knew. They had watched him struggle to keep his eyes open the night before. At 2:00 in the morning, he had been on guard duty. At 5:00, his unit moved forward. At 7:00, German mortar fire hit their position. At 8:00, they were ordered to relocate again. By noon, Miller's body was simply done. He sat down against a hedge, and without meaning to, he fell asleep. Back at the field headquarters, his platoon commander, First Lieutenant Robert Hayes, was looking for him. Hayes was 26, a former school teacher from Indiana. He knew Miller. He also knew what would happen if someone important found a soldier sleeping near the front. The regulations were clear. Sleeping while assigned to duty could bring severe punishment, especially during combat operations. So when one of his sergeants reported that Miller was missing, Hayes immediately started searching. What he didn't know was that Eisenhower had already found him. The general stopped a few feet away. The soldier didn't move. One aide looked shocked. "Sir, he hasn't even noticed us." Another officer shook his head. "That's unacceptable." Still Eisenhower said nothing. He crouched slightly and studied the young man's face. Mud, unshaven beard, dark circles beneath closed eyes. Exhaustion, not laziness. Exhaustion. Then Eisenhower looked at the soldier's boots. The mud was layered almost to the ankles, days old. No opportunity to clean them, no opportunity to rest. The general turned toward one of his aides. "Find his unit." The aide hurried away. A few moments later, Lieutenant Hayes arrived. Breathing hard, he came to attention immediately. Sir Eisenhower nodded. "Is this your man?" "Yes, sir. Why is he asleep?" Hayes hesitated, not because he lacked an answer, because he wasn't sure if the truth would help. The general waited. Finally, Hayes spoke. "Because he's exhausted, sir." The aide beside Eisenhower frowned. That's not an excuse. Hayes remained silent. Eisenhower looked at him. When did he last sleep? The lieutenant thought for a moment. I'm not entirely sure, sir. Give me your best estimate. Maybe 3 hours in the last 2 days. The general's expression changed. Only slightly, but enough. What about the rest of your platoon? Not much better, sir. Hayes explained the constant movement, the mortar attacks, the night patrols, the lack of relief personnel, the shortage of experienced replacements. Everything. Eisenhower listened without interruption. When Hayes finished, the field fell quiet. The general looked back at the sleeping soldier, then at the lieutenant. Have you slept? Hayes blinked. No, sir. How long? The lieutenant swallowed. About 4 hours in the last 48. One of Eisenhower's staff officers shifted uncomfortably. The conversation was heading somewhere unexpected. The general remained silent for several seconds. Then he asked another question. How many men in your company? 172 when we landed, sir. And now? 112. The answer hung in the air. Nobody spoke. The sounds of distant artillery drifted across the countryside. Eisenhower finally nodded. Wake him. Hayes stepped forward carefully. Tom, nothing. Tom. The soldier stirred. His eyes opened slowly. For a second he looked confused. Then he saw the cluster of officers. Then the stars on Eisenhower's shoulders. The color drained from his face. He jumped to his feet, too quickly. He nearly lost his balance. Sir, the words came out in panic. He knew. Everyone knew. A soldier asleep near the front. This could end badly. Very badly. Eisenhower studied him for a moment, then asked a single question. When did you last sleep? Miller opened his mouth. Nothing came out. He genuinely didn't know. Finally he answered. I don't remember, sir. The field became quiet again. The general nodded slowly. Then he turned toward his staff. What do you see? The officers exchanged looks. Nobody answered. Eisenhower asked again. What do you see? One officer finally spoke. A soldier asleep on duty, sir. The general shook his head. No. He pointed toward the young private. I see a soldier who's reached the limit of human endurance. Nobody said anything. Eisenhower continued. If a man collapses from exhaustion after 6 days of combat, that is not primarily his failure. His gaze moved across the assembled officers. It is a leadership problem. The words landed heavily because every officer there understood exactly what he meant. An exhausted army became a dangerous army. Mistakes increased. Reaction time slowed. Judgment failed. People died, not because they lacked courage, because they lacked sleep. Eisenhower looked back at Lieutenant Hayes. When your bridge is repaired, take your platoon out of the line for 12 hours. Hayes blinked. Sir? 12 hours. The lieutenant looked stunned. So they can sleep. Yes, sir. Eisenhower turned toward one of his staff officers. I want a report on frontline rotation schedules by tomorrow morning. Yes, sir. I want to know which units are receiving relief and which are not. Yes, sir. The officer was already taking notes. Eisenhower nodded once, then looked at Miller. The young soldier still stood rigidly at attention. Terrified, the general's expression softened, only slightly. Private, sir, you've done your duty. Miller swallowed. Yes, sir, now do something else. The soldier looked confused. Get some sleep. For the first time all day a few men smiled, even Miller. Eisenhower returned to his vehicle and continued the inspection. But the story didn't end there. The report arrived the next morning. Several frontline companies had been operating with dangerously little rest, combat pressure, logistical delays, personnel shortages, no single failure. Just dozens of small problems creating one large one. Eisenhower pushed commanders to improve rotation schedules wherever possible. It didn't solve everything. War rarely allowed perfect solutions. But it reduced exhaustion in critical sectors. Weeks later, Lieutenant Hayes learned that the conversation in the field had reached higher headquarters, not because anyone wanted publicity, because Eisenhower had used the incident as an example, a reminder. Leaders must understand the condition of their men, not just their positions on a map, not just their ammunition levels, their condition, their limits, their humanity. Thomas Miller survived Normandy. He survived the war. He returned to Kansas in 1945. For years, he told almost nobody about meeting Eisenhower. When friends asked about the war, he usually changed the subject. But occasionally, someone would press him. Then he would tell a short version of the story. Not about being caught asleep. Not about being scared. Not about standing in front of the supreme commander of Allied forces. He always remembered something else. The question. Not why were you sleeping? Not what's wrong with you? Not who failed? The question was simpler. When did you last sleep? Years later, Miller said that was the moment he understood something important about leadership. The best leaders don't start by looking for someone to blame. They start by trying to understand what happened. And sometimes that changes everything. If you were in Eisenhower's position and found a soldier asleep near the front lines during combat, what would you have done? Let us know in the comments. And if you want to hear about the day Eisenhower stopped his convoy for a single wounded private, and why nobody in his staff understood the decision until years later, that story is next. Hit subscribe so you don't miss it.